Ira Sachs into this wonderful film. Welcome, and thank you for joining us. So one of the things that really struck me about the film when I sat down to watch it initially was, and I think you've probably gotten asked about this probably by most people, is just how weirdly appealing and yet off-putting Tomas is. Mm-hmm. He's a very, like, as what he does is something that as a person I'm just like, oh, why? But yet I'm compelled to keep watching him. Like, what kind of was your inspiration for him as a character?
And thank you all for being here. It's really nice to be in a small, intimate screening with a bunch of New Yorkers. So, well, it's interesting because I started with two things. One was the idea to make a film about what men with power do with it. And the other was having seen Franz Rogowski, the actor who plays Tomas, in a film by Michael Haneke called Happy End, and having him in my mind for many years that I wanted to make a film for and with him. Mm-hmm. So we wrote the script for Franz Rogowski. If you haven't seen Happy End and you're sort of curious about that, it's a great movie and I recommend it, but if you don't feel like watching the whole movie, there's a karaoke scene where he sings Sia's Chandelier, which is on YouTube, and you can just watch that scene and you'll go like, oh, I get it, why he wanted to write a film for that guy. He's amazing, and he's so original and so physical and so charismatic and to me very likable, even when he does things that aren't so likable. But I think knowing that we were writing, Mauricio Zacharias and myself, my co-writer, we were writing for Franz, I didn't really doubt that people would find ways to be drawn in by him, because I was. And, the history of cinema is filled with people who particularly men, behaving badly. Like, that's, for me, one of the most gripping things in film is thinking about and actually sharing with Franz when he got a little nervous, sharing James Cagney movies with him, and looking at people like Cagney or like Travis Bickle or various people who do terrible things but do it with such energy that you want to watch.
Yeah, absolutely.
I also don't think I actually I would fall for that guy. Let's put it that way. Maybe I have.
Well, I would say that it's believable that people do, and that they want to be around him, which is, I think, a hard thing sometimes. I mean, you have to have the right actor, which you certainly seem to have had.
Yeah. I think it's also, there's a script. So the script's structured around three characters who each have desires that they follow. Mm-hmm. So it's not so clear after the first couple of scenes who has power and who doesn't, right? It keeps shifting in different moments of the film. So I think that creates a kind of vulnerability for each of the characters, because you see both what they have and what they don't have. They also each, as actors, really hold a certain kind of command. So, and I think that's very important for this film, and I think particularly with both Ben Whishaw and Adéle Exarchopoulos, I benefited from the fact that they're strong presences. And so Adéle, that part, she does something with it in which things get bad, but you never sense that she is a victim to the characters in the film. She makes choices.
Yeah, which is making choices such a great hallmark of quality writing, is characters doing that, I think. And hard to remember to do it as you're writing, I think, sometimes.
Well, I think, the script is, the film is very observational in a certain way. It seems like everyday life in a lot of ways, but it's actually very structured. It begins with a man on a pedestal, and it ends with a man on a floor, and we have to get there. And in each scene, something is at stake, something is lost, and something unexpected might happen. So really, I would say it begins with a script in which we try to construct something that has an energy of suspense. I call this an action film and a suspense film. What suspense is really, it's emotional.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a compelling approach to it. One of the other things that I know has come up with this film in particular is when it went through the MPAA, it got an NC-17 rating, which I know you've spoken out about how it's really censorship, the way that they approach this, and like, do you feel if the main couple wasn't gay, would it still be an NC-17, or like the same content?
I can't really answer that question. For me, because I can say that the board who creates the MPAA is an unnamed group of parents. So this is a very odd thing. Like, why parents should be alone should be deciding this, and why are they unnamed? And I will say that the history of the MPAA begins with the Hays Code, which was 1930s America, which was really the thing that changed cinema in America more than almost anything else, maybe Jaws and the Hays Code. But the Hays Code, not only were certain images not allowed, but certain narratives weren't allowed. So suddenly people had to be punished for what were considered bad actions. It really took away a lot of the liberty. If you're interested in American cinema, go back to the 1930s and see the freedom of those movies. And I think for me, that's the kind of movie that I wanted to make.
Yeah, that makes sense. Like trying to go to a place before, because even though we're past the Hays Code by almost a century, it still has an impact on how we.
Well, the Hays Code became the MPAA code.
Yeah.
So we're not actually past it. We're still in a system in which, the question for me when this film got an NC-17 was less the impact on this film. It was, I had a distributor who was happy to distribute the film as it was, and I got to make exactly the film. More, it's a question of why does the MPAA still exist? It's sort of it's a question. We've all lived with it for so long. We're sort of like, oh, because it does. But you're sort of like, but why? Very simple questions need to be asked.
And why does this get this rating and that? Why does this a PG-13 and that's an R? And you hear too many stories about some.
Yeah. Someone said to me something that I thought was interesting, and they guessed that maybe the reason, what made what is kind of somewhat unique or at least interesting about the film and the sex scenes in the film is they're long, and because they're long without cuts, they almost seem real. So the film is actually not that it's too explicit, it's too real for people who want to, for that silly board, I don't know who they are. So.
I think that's sort of famously nobody does.
Yeah.
But yeah, I'll throw it out to the audience. Does anybody in the audience have a question? To start, I see one right there.
Yes. I noticed there were a couple. This is kind of about like a shot or two in the movie, but there was a couple where Tomas was in dialogue with the other characters, but he was like completely blocking the spectators from their face, and I feel like I have my interpretation of that, but I kind of wanted to like.
I'd be interested in yours first.
What yours? Well, for me, it's just like simply that Tomas is a narcissist from my perspective. I don't know if that's like exactly the case, but he's pretty narcissistic. So I thought that was kind of a really strong move to show that, because of how his character and his wants and his needs and his feelings always come first in his mind. And you can see that in his conversation, like in his argument with his husband. His husband is like, I forget what he said, but Tomas like automatically switches it back to like, but that's what I'm feeling, like something like that. I don't remember exactly, but I just thought that's kind of what it mirrored for me.
Yeah, that's interesting. I think for me, I really try to avoid, particularly when I'm in production making the film, I try to avoid metaphor as much as I can. So that being said, metaphors come out of a film because it exists as a story and as an art form and as an experience for the audience. So I think those scenes were not planned to be quite as elusive to the audience as they are. Meaning, like, I didn't say, let's move him into a place where he's in front of the camera and blocking the other person. What I did do is, there's a cinematic strategy of the film, which is minimal on purpose. In a way, the camera is placed in a position in which it's able to see everything, but is not always given special access. So the camera is a voyeur. And the action is happening between the actors, the characters, the two people in front of the camera. So sometimes, for example, if you just stay on the corner of the bed and you're watching that from that perspective, someone might move and block the camera without me telling them to, but I don't stop the camera at that moment. And what I notice for the experience of the film, it makes me think of Polanski's Rosemary's Baby. There's a very famous shot in that film where Mia Farrow is sitting on a bed, and there's a door frame, and we only see her legs, and she's on the phone, she's talking to someone, but you can't see her face. And Polanski would say that he imagined that the whole audience would go like this together collectively. They would try to see around the door. And I think that's really true. It feels in a way so real that you believe you could see around the door. Like that's part of, because you're actually in the room. So there's this process of being both inclusive and exclusive. Now, that being said, what you said about the narcissism, the term or not the term, I will say as a presence, Tomas/Franz is not worrying whether he's blocking the camera. That's not his concern. He wants to and he's also a very aggressive personality and physicality. So I think in a way you're speaking to something that's very true. He knew where the camera was. But he wasn't going to make room for the other actor. I mean, which, by the way, he's the greatest guy. I'm not saying he's not a narcissist as a person, but the character does take up space very comfortably.
What's the name of the method that's called the cinematic?
The cinematic
method?
It's just my method. I mean, when I say that, I think there's a lot of filmmakers in the room. And just to sort of talk about method, and for me, I don't rehearse with my actors before we start shooting. So they've never done a read-through, they've never done a table read, we've never had a formal rehearsal. I work with each actor individually, and then I spend a lot of time figuring out what they're gonna wear, which is actually very much a form of rehearsal because you're creating character through the decisions around costumes. You're also creating familiarity and intimacy. But I spend about 5 or 6 weeks of pre-production with the cinematographer coming up with a shooting plan, which is very rehearsed. I end up with a storyboard where the entire film is drawn. And I bring that to set with the actors. I'm telling them where to move and how to move through space, and for me, that's really kind of the space in which I feel I have the most impact as a visual artist, is how the camera works with the bodies. But then what's going to happen between those bodies is very, what I consider emotionally improvised. So not improvised by text very often. I would say 2 scenes in the film that are improvised, which I think have an effect on the rest, are the opening scene, where there was 1 page of dialogue, but we shot for 3 hours, and the scene in the lunch with the parents, which was scripted fully, except in 1 take, I told Franz to go back to the table, and then the last bit that you see in that 1 take is very improvised, and I like in films how certain moments of real freedom or play or creativity inform the rest of the film. It makes the rest of the film seem more authentic.
Any other questions? Let's go with you in the front here.
You had just said that you spent a lot of time thinking about the costumes, and I was really drawn by the costumes, especially Agot's wardrobe as a whole.
Right.
And I would love to just hear more about what
what goes into that for you?
Sure. I worked with a wonderful costume designer, Adéle Exarchopoulos, in Paris, and she and I talked about a lot of things, including color, the impact of color, not like what color means, again, but what color does. So red, blue, yellow, white, these are things that are really strong, and they create a kind of a poetic kind of impact. Again, impact is something I think about a lot. We also talked about skin. I wanted to make a sexy film. I wanted to make a kind of horny film. And so that meant both the characters, but also the bodies and the images. And then I would say a very important moment for us was we had 2 racks of clothes for specifically, let's say, for Agathe. And one was like an average Parisian elementary school teacher that you'd see on a subway, and very plain and kind of ordinary. And then another was the rack that actually Brigitte Bardot could have worn the entire outfit, and we went with the Bardot. So that included hair, makeup, face, face in a kind of voguing kind of way. I mean, she's really working it. And I would say in all the characters, but specifically Tomas and Agathe, like their bodies become kind of sculptures, and what they can do with the clothes conveys a lot to both story and also emotion, and also sex appeal. So those were some of the. We talked specifically about Godard's Contempt. That was a really important film for us. Fassbinder, a movie called Beware of the Holy Whore, which just is a great looking, like the costumes are not, they're not frightened, let's put it that way.
Other questions? You on the end there.
I think true to the title and true to the way the film starts and ends, it's a film that lives a lot in the in-between moments for these characters. Mm-hmm. We miss a lot of the big explosive moments. We don't see the abortion. We don't see the first breakup between Martin and Thomas. So I wanted to ask how, if you could talk more about developing that structure.
Yes. I think of the movie and the movies how I make movies in a way is like a series of middles. So the film is a middle, like there was a life before the film, there's a life after the film, but this is the part that you get to see, and you feel that life before and after, even if you're not told about it. Each scene, I try to figure out when to get in and when to get out, where you're not actually drawn up and down in every scene, but you're actually drawn forward. There's a momentum. I think it's working a lot if you think about how cinema verite works in documentary, so that disorienting the audience is not something that I avoid, though ultimately I have to orient them. So that's the interesting balance, is how to give people, I feel like I don't, I'm not trying to like keep you from certain scenes, I just don't think the movie needs them. So in the writing process, I find like if the script was this script is probably 90 pages, but maybe at some point it was 110 pages, and there were certain scenes that I thought, we don't really need that. We can get from there to there without that. So having a sense of what ellipse brings the audience closer, but not wanting to push the audience out. So that's really the balance.
They're in the back there. You just put your hand back down. Yeah, you there.
The abortion. I knew that she was going to have an abortion, and I'm curious, it was the way she's developed, her personality. I had that feeling very early on that she's going to get an abortion. Was it deliberate? Were you building to that intentionally, or by the choice of the actress and the way she did it? That's in her strength or something like that?
I wouldn't say, I will say we always knew she wasn't going to have a kid. So in some ways, it's inherent in the film. And maybe the film is playing out something that has to happen, like that you sense this, you somewhat sense these people are not going to be together. Like it's a film about building something that needs to disappear for all of them. They all need to go in different directions. So to that extent, I will say that in the scene in the country house when she goes to visit Martin and Tomas and their friends, to me that scene plays like a horror movie. From the minute when she arrives, I'm thinking, get out of the house. Like really, and it gets worse, right? It gets worse. And I think that was intentional, partially because I will say that like there's sort of no one gets away without being culpable in the film. So Agathe enters a relationship of two married people and is fine about whatever that disruption her role is going to play. Tomas is Tomas. We don't have to like lay out the ways in which he follows his own needs. But then in the scene in the country house, you really see that Martin really thinks of Agathe as disposable. And to me, that was very interesting, almost in the form of metaphor, in the sense of like what is the relationship between this gay male culture and women in that culture and the space. And so that there were places where I could see violence that came in all different directions.
And then I think you, sir, have had your hand up a couple times.
First of all, thank you so much for coming to speak with us, and really appreciate it. And something that I found really interesting about what you said was that the orientation of making the movie was seeing how men act in positions of power. And something that I've been noticing in like a couple of films recently is finding these like men in positions of power and like getting them to like ultimate point of like loneliness. And I was kind of curious to like kind of hear like what the role of loneliness played like in the writing process, and even like more literally how like the writing process went for you. I know you work with collaborators in the writing process and how that works. Writing is typically thought of a solitary kind of activity, so I'm kind of curious to hear how that kind of like played out in kind of a very technical way as making it, and also maybe in a more philosophical way on like how like that contributed to the movie.
Okay, thanks. Interesting, good questions you guys have. I would say the first question about loneliness, I think I am attuned to the fact that movies need periods of quiet. And this is a very active movie. People are always engaged with each other. And then I knew specifically that the bicycle could be like points of reverie, points of reflection, both for the character, because for a moment he's not with anyone, and also for the audience, because you get to watch. You don't have to kind of listen in a certain way. You can kind of be both observing and also identifying with someone in the. So I think I do build in these kinds of phrases in the film. In terms of the writing process, this is the 5th film I've co-written with Mauricio Zacharias. So we have a pretty set way of working, which involves a long process of a couple of 2 or 3 or 4 months where we outline the film, really scene by scene, character by character, what's going to happen. We do that together. We're often basing that work on a relationship to another film. So this film, for example, both a movie called Lulu by Maurice Pialat, which is a love triangle between a woman and 2 men, and then a film by Visconti called The Innocent, which is the last film of Visconti about a very powerful man with a mistress and a wife. Both those films gave us great scenes to work with, and most of my films have worked with a kind of uber narrative which comes from another movie. It seems like it works for them, maybe it'll work for me. And after we do this very detailed outline, then he goes and he writes the first draft, and that's another, can be 6 months, can be it takes a long time for him to write the first draft, and then I tend to write the next draft, or maybe he writes one more, and then ultimately I write the last draft, and the last draft becomes, I don't write very many drafts, and we don't collectively. I would say we write 2 or 3 at most. I generally feel that movies have their DNA, and it's not about perfecting the script, it's about kind of moving the script forward and seeing what happens in the process and what you discover. So for me, the script was written for New York. We moved to Paris. It came to Paris. I cast Adéle Exarchopoulos. That changes the movie a lot. I discover a location which is this printing factory which seems like a better job for Ben Whishaw's character than an architecture firm, which was in the earlier draft. So I'm very, very responsive to what happens in the process, and then ultimately the final draft is really me directing the script, which includes rewriting to some extent. But my co-writer's always there if I need him, so that's good too. I think my art form as a filmmaker is collaboration. Like it's just where I feel the most comfortable and excited as an artist.
All right, I think we can do a couple more. Go ahead.
Me?
Yeah.
So Tomas is a director, and I kind of have a two-part question. One being, was that always intended to be his profession? And then the second part being, if he was like real, or if he was your peer, because we kind of see him directing a little bit in the beginning, how do you think that your directing style would kind of differ from his?
Sure. He was always a filmmaker from the first second he was imagined, as far as I remember. And I think for me, I've written about a number of filmmakers in my career, and I've written about a lot of writers, painters, musicians. I'm interested in creative people. I'm interested partially because I find them interesting, but also because it's my life. Like it's the closest thing that I have a lot of material to talk about. And so, for example, in this film, it's like second nature that I know that there's an arc in filmmaking from completing a film shoot to premiering it at a festival. I know that just by experience, so that is something I can give to the film. If it's something I don't know, then I have to figure out how to get it right, and that's a lot of work. So, for example, with Ben Whishaw, Martin's character, I didn't know what those people do in that space, and so I ended up going there with my phone and filming the guy who had his job for an afternoon for 4 or 5 hours, and then I found like 2 30-second pieces. One was with these two men who'd come to buy a poster of something that they designed, and then I ended up hiring those two guys to come back to be themselves in the movie. And the assistants, what he's telling his assistants, like, how would I know what he's going to say? But I just had it on tape, so I used exactly the dialogue that he had said to the two assistants, who I got the two assistants to play themselves. So it's like Ben Whishaw has a little bit no idea what he's talking about, but it's exactly right. And so that's what I don't need to do that with film. I've been there, so I have all that material. That being said, the opening scene with which you asked about, the opening scene, I did find a behind-the-scenes documentary of the director Maurice Pialat, who's a French director who I revere and study and think about a lot, directing a film called Police, and there's like 45 seconds of him really giving a woman who's an extra in the film, a lot of shit for how she's doing and how bad she is. And it's so shocking that I was like, that's great dialogue. Because you immediately go like, that's a man with power who understands how to use it and is very comfortable with exploiting it. So that was really useful for me also. So I use documentary in an interesting fashion. I think the second question, what was it again?
It was just like, how would you say that your directing style might differ from?
Well, it's almost oppositional, because I would never tell an actor how to move. I would tell him where to move, like enter, leave, but I would almost never tell him how to move. And which doesn't mean I'm not very connected to the actors when they're acting, but I feel like in general with collaboration, for me, I try to give people the space to feel free and discover on their own. So I try to disappear like a therapist. I try to be present. I mean, really, it's like being present and absent. They totally know that I'm there, and I'm completely paying attention, like maniacally paying attention. But I don't want to hear myself talk, as I do here. I don't talk about subtext. I don't talk about motivation. I avoid these things that will simplify the work for them and also make it more literal. As opposed to him, who's like trying to like, so I don't know. People said, is he a good filmmaker? We kind of established he's not a terrible filmmaker because he's going to the Venice Film Festival. So that kind of just says, okay, you might not like his films, but he's not like, he's established himself somehow.
All right, we can do one more. I think you've had your hand up a couple
My
times.
question has to do with why you chose to film it in Paris. A lot of the shots scream stereotypical Parisian, from the staircase, the bicycle, the outfits, the striped tops. If it was originally written for New York, which a lot of the, I guess the costumes and shots would not really match, what was your inspiration to shoot it in France and have sort of...
Oh, I think those clothes would have been fine in New York, to be honest. To me,
The striped top, like where she was like in the studio with the striped top and the dress, like I'm French, and so I see that, and like, really for me, that's like 2018 Parisian. Like, I have a hard time envisioning it in New York sometimes.
Right. I'm sure it would have been different. It's interesting because I'm working on something now. It's in New York, and like somebody has to wear jeans, and we realize jeans are really different in London, Paris, and New York. Like, yes, there's definitely a difference. I don't think. I mean, to me, these are. I'll say two things. These are the spaces that were evocative to me in Paris, and part of that is because they have history. So in New York, I do the same thing. Many of the places I've shot in New York no longer exist because I'm always trying to find the restaurant that's older than 20 years. But really, the restaurants I've tended to shoot in here are 50 and 60 and 70 years old, even if it's a diner, just because it has history. So I'm always looking for things that have age in them. And I think I lived in Paris when I was in college. I spent 3 months there. I didn't speak French. I don't speak it very well now. But I ended up going to the movies like every day, a couple times a day, and I saw 197 movies in 3 months, and it changed my life, and I became very engaged with French cinema and with Paris specifically. So I've gone, I don't know France, but I do know Paris, and I've spent a lot of the last 30 years of my life there, and I've had relationships there, and I've had breakups there, and I felt really comfortable there, and it felt like these people could be also.
Interesting. So yeah, so the film is it's on Mubi, I think.
Yep.
And I know it's also on other platforms for rent or purchase. Please. You've seen it. Encourage other folks to watch it. Is there anything else we should be? You were just mentioning you got something else that you're working on. I don't know if should we be looking out for that in the next year or two, or?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I got to make it, and
fingers crossed.
I mean, the nice thing about making something new is you just get new fear instead of old fear. So now, like, as soon as something's finished, you just figure out, what are the risks of the next one, and they continue. So hopefully it'll turn out okay.
Well, let's have another round of applause for Ira for the film.
Thank you.